these patients. So going through these cases might be more relevant. So each of these topics we will discuss in depth. So I'll start with the case. So we saw a 34-year-old lady about 1.5 years ago. She was symptomatic for 6 months with episodic symptoms. Like she has had low-grade fevers episodically. Over this period, she had lost some weight and she had breathlessness over the last 3 months prior to evaluation. She also had associated with breathlessness some intermittent moderate hemoptysis. She was not on any drugs or medications, including contraceptives. She had denied any exposure to any inhaled fumes. She was initially seen outside in Madurai, actually, where she was evaluated as pulmonary tuberculosis. Multiple sputum AFBs and experts were negative, and viral serology were all negative. She was started on empiric ATT as sputum negative pulmonary tuberculosis, but she had ongoing weight loss after 2 months of ATT. She had gone to another physician who had given her for breathlessness steroids, with which she had a marked clinical as well as actually radiological improvement, but that had been tapered over the period of 2 weeks and stopped, and the symptoms started 2 weeks again after stopping that, and this had happened at almost about 3 times prior to evaluation. So you can see the first X-ray when she had this hemoptysis was admitted with breathlessness on ATT. At the time, casualty, she got given hydrocortisone, which had been continued during admission. So over the course, she was significantly better over a period of 7 days. She was discharged. Again, she had 1 month later, she had cough, hemoptysis, not as much as the last time. X-ray again showing in consolidation, but in a different location. Again, brief period of steroids, got better. And this is the last is when she came to us showing consolidation, which is near the diaphragm rather than perihilar, which was seen earlier. This is CT corresponding to the second admission, showing bilateral low lobe ground glassing, which with more consolidation on the left compared to the right. On close examination, we didn't find any major finding, no clubbing. She was a bit pale, but not markedly, no colonychia or other findings. She did not have any history of any joint pains, arthritis, or any CTD symptoms. We did find this punched out ulcer in the right hand, and she did not complain of any Raynaud's, however. And the fingertips pulps were all normal. So investigation showed anemia, leukocytosis with normal creatinine, and urine routine was normal. Echo showed normal LV function with some moderate pH. So at this point, where this is a live audience, I would ask what are your differential diagnosis. For the sake of time, we just take this. The differential diagnosis that I considered when I saw this patient initially was some relapsing kind of ILD with acute presentation. So typically that would include an eosinophilic pneumonia, hypersensitive pneumonitis with repeated exposures. AIP is typically not relapsing, but given the acute presentation, low lobe dominance was consistent with the AIP. Of course, OP can sometimes be kind of up and down with relapsing kind of pattern. The other possibility was pulmonary vasculitis with alveolar hemorrhage. The other possibilities included mitral stenosis and other rare lung diseases like veno-occlusive disease or capillary hemangiomatosis, just to complete the list. So having considered pulmonary vasculitis as one of the differential diagnoses in this patient, so one wonders what are the diseases which are included under this entity, pulmonary vasculitis. When we say pulmonary vasculitis, it includes a wide variety of individual disease entities which are characterized by primary inflammation of the vessels themselves rather than other structures. This inflammation is often neutrophil driven and is characterized by necrosis of blood vessels within the lung. The etiology and pathogenesis of this entity, often what triggers it remains unknown. The approach primarily is driven by the size and site of the blood vessels involved. And Chapel Hill nomenclature first in 1994 was the one which kind of put this all together. Diagnosis is based on a pattern or a group of constellation of clinical, radiological, laboratory, and pathological findings. However, none of these are specific for a given individual syndrome, and often this presentation can be mimicked by a wide variety of infections and drug toxicity, and several other conditions as well. So it's often non-specific and non-sensitive. On top of it, the presentation can often be fulminant and challenging to diagnose. These are also very rare disorders. For example, put together the common frequency may be less than 100 per million. In Caucasians, there is no such data for Indians. In Indian population, most large hospitals, say like PGI or AIIMS, would see about 10-15 cases per year put together. The pulmonary vasculitic syndromes, I mean. In India, there is some data that Takayasu's is the most common vasculitis in adults, and what used to be called Henoch-Schönlein purpura is the most common vasculitis in children. There, of course, based on my observation, I feel that personally there is a north-south divide in the sense that in the north there is more primary vasculitis, whereas in the south there is more vasculitis due to SLE as opposed to primary vasculitis. But this is quite arbitrary with what I observed in two major teaching hospitals in the north and south. So when you speak about what exactly are these vasculitic syndromes, like I said, the approach is primarily based on the size of the vessel. So if you say large vessel, medium vessel, and small vessel, large vessel is primarily, as we will be seeing in the next slide, that of the aorta and its major branches. It includes the carotid, subclavian, cerebral vessels, and femoral arteries. Of course, the pulmonary arteries are also included in this large vessels. Medium vessels are the next big branches, like visceral branches, renal, hepatic, mesenteric, and coronary. And everything else like arterioles, capillaries are all small vessels. Now, when you say large vessel, it typically includes, there can be some overlap with medium vessel. However, a large vessel vasculitis typically does not involve the small vessel. Similarly, a small vessel vasculitis can sometimes involve the medium vessel, but it does not involve the large vessel. So, this is the overall scheme of classification. When you see large vessel vasculitis, the two big syndromes are Takayasu's and giant cell arteritis. Takayasu's is the Asian common vasculitis, typically less than 40 years, involvement of aorta and its big branches, namely subclavian and all, often young women. Giant cell arteritis is typically a Caucasian disease, more than 40 years, temporal artery involvement, etc. Medium vessel vasculitis is historically the first vasculitis that was ever described in 1866 by Kussmaul and Meyer. PAN was the first vasculitic syndrome that was ever clinically diagnosed ever in the literature. Kawasaki's is a pediatric disease, also called as mucocutaneous vasculitis, which of course there is a resurgence of interest with COVID, which can cause a similar kind of picture sometimes. Small vessel vasculitis is predominantly the focus of this talk, because most of the pulmonary vasculitis are of course small vessel vasculitis. The top entities under this are grouped under what is called the ANCA-associated vasculitis, often because they are associated with a serological marker called anti-neutrophilic antibody. So, so these entities, probably what used to be called vaginous granulomatosis, is now classified as granulomatosis with polyangiitis. What used to be called Churg-Strauss syndrome is now called eosinophilic granulomatosis with polyangiitis, and the third entity called microscopic polyangiitis. Often, sometimes, in the absence of markers and lung-limited syndrome, this can sometimes be called an idiopathic autoimmune capillaritis or glomerulonephritis. Of course, it can be a limited organ-limited issue. Often there are other secondary vasculitis, that is, it can be associated with the immune complex deposition, associated with the SLE, RA, and APLA syndrome, or it can be primary immune complex mediated disease like Goodpasture syndrome or IgA vasculitis, what was earlier called as Henoch-Schönlein purpura. So these are all the primary vasculitic syndrome. When we speak about pulmonary vasculitis, the entities that are most common that we need to discuss today are GPA, EGPA, microscopic polyangiitis or MPA, some secondary vasculitis associated with the SLE, which is common especially in South India, and of course the vasculitic mimics. We will briefly touch upon the other syndromes where possible. So we've already talked about the vessel size and classification. So why did this become important? Why is the vessel size important? Vessel size is important primarily because that is how the clinical features will be present, because in vasculitis the primary involvement is of the vessels. So all the clinical features accrue are because of involvement of the vessels per se. So irrespective of the organ involved, the vessel involvement will give you the characteristic features of this. And briefly, this is the history of the evolution of our vasculitic syndrome understanding. So the first PAN was described in 1866 by Kussmaul and Meyer. Wegener, who was actually a Nazi guard during Hitler's reign, in 1939 described what is now recognized as the first case of Wegener's granulomatosis. In 51, Churg and Strauss described Churg-Strauss syndrome, what we now recognize as EGPA. Seek and Goodman and Churg all put together different classification systems of these vasculitic syndromes. Kawasaki described the mucocutaneous vasculitis in 1967. The Chapel Hill nomenclature was first to give nomenclatures, descriptions of each of these vasculitic syndromes as to how to differentiate, say, GPA from MPA and otherwise. So they described the characteristic syndrome of each of these syndromes. So this Chapel Hill has subsequently been revised 2 times. The current revision was in 2012. Now, these each of these individual syndromes, as you can see, has been explicitly defined. For example, when you say GPA, it is described as a necrotizing granulomatous inflammation that involves the upper and lower respiratory tract with necrotizing vasculitis affecting predominantly small and medium vessels. Necrotizing glomerulonephritis is common. What this tells you is what the syndrome is. What this does not tell you is how to diagnose this. So this is important. So these are what we call as nomenclature symptoms, the nomenclature of the particular disease, and this is different from diagnostic criteria of the disease or classification criteria of the disease. We'll come to this point again. So we go to the second point. What are the clinical features or scenarios that should trigger suspicion for pulmonary vasculitis? As I've already described, the primary involvement is that of the vessel. So the clinical features will follow the blood vessel that is being involved by the vasculitic syndrome. So say in a large vessel vasculitis, the aorta and the proximal branches are affected. So one gets the features of involvement of the major vessels like absence of pulses and asymmetric blood pressures, that characteristic of Tyvaso's arthritis. Limb claudication, that can be present if the lower limb blood vessels are affected. Bruit or auscultation. Aortic dilatation, which can constitute because of the pressure differences, and if the renal artery is involved, renovascular hypertension. Thyroids are involved, stroke. So these are the characteristic features of large vessel vasculitis. As I've already described, most of the pulmonary vasculitis are small vessel vasculitis. So what we usually get is lung involvement due to necrotizing granulomas, which can usually be present with hemoptysis or cough. Massive involvement of the capillaries of the lung, which can present as alveolar hemorrhage. Similar other vascular beds being involved, small vessels, namely the kidney and skin. So one can get glomerulonephritis, vesicular bullous lesions, urticaria. Nails can be involved with splinter hemorrhages, and eye manifestations be often be associated. What is common to all of these is systemic symptoms that are almost always present, more than 90% of the time, in a vasculitic syndrome: fever, anorexia, chills, and weight loss. And often this makes it challenging to diagnose when the differential is an infection. So a pictographic way of looking at the same thing, but specifically the small vessel vasculitis, we often have involvement of the lung, kidney, skin, or brain. So the prototypic clinical situations wherein I am called or I see a patient in the OPD when I consider pulmonary vasculitis would be: 1, cavitary lung disease, which could be with or without upper airway disease, or with or without renal disease. The second syndrome would be the alveolar hemorrhage syndrome. Third would be often a referral from a nephrologist when they're considering lung involvement in their patient with rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis, because it's often easier to do a lavage than, say, a kidney biopsy. Pulmonary renal syndromes is the polar severest form of the pulmonary vasculitic syndromes. Sometimes pulmonary vasculitis are picked up while evaluation for non-responding pneumonia. Difficult to treat asthma, and asthma presenting at hypereosinophilia or asthma presenting with peripheral neuropathy in the neurology clinic and consultations therein are some of the other ways I picked up Church-Strauss syndrome during the last several years. So let's go by as case scenarios in each of these prototypic syndromes so that we can pick up the problems that arise while seeing these patients. Say for the first example, cavitary pulmonary disease. This is a patient that I saw, 47-year-old lady who was slightly obese but otherwise had no comorbidities. She had symptomatic for 6 months with non-resolving weight loss, low-grade fevers. She had breathlessness with no hemoptysis over the last 3 months. X-rays outside had shown cavity in the right lung. She was evaluated as tuberculosis. Multiple AFBs and experts were negative. She started an empiric ATT, but she had ongoing weight loss and cough. And ultrasound abdomen had shown a bulky uterus, so she was referred as actually malignancy with secondaries to the lung. So when I saw her, there was quite a thick wall cavity in the right lower lobe with a small effusion again there. So we got a clinical examination, did not show any nodes or mass. OBG examination was normal, breasts were normal. Bronchoscopy, the AFB smear and expert in the bowel from the right lower lobe was negative. Contrast CT did not show any embolism, and serologies were all negative. Echocardiography did not show any vegetations. Urine routine was normal, and ocular examination and PNS examination was normal, as well as the X-rays of the orbit and PNS were normal. So with this, two main possibilities remain, whether this was a malignancy or whether this was a vasculitic syndrome. This is true for all cavitary lung disease. The differential diagnosis would include infections, which could include tuberculosis, fungal, nocardial infections, or say non-tubercular mycobacterial infections. It could include malignancy, it can include a vasculitis, and finally septic pulmonary embolism or a cavitated pulmonary embolism. These would be the kind of differential diagnosis that one considers when we see a cavitary disease. In this patient, the ANCA was by immunofluorescence was very strongly positive. You can see that it was 3 plus. However, the PR3 ANCA was negative. So at this time, this patient was also given the possibility of malignancy, underwent a biopsy. As you can see, the biopsy has been reported as showing large areas of necrosis with extensive choriorrhexis and nuclear dust. There were outlines of thrombosed blood vessels within these necrotic foci. I'm sorry, I don't have the image per se, but this is the actual report that came out. So there was evidence of fibrinal necrosis, vasculitis, and however, there were no granulomas. So, so bear in mind when we come back to discussion about diagnosis again, all these points. Based on this, a diagnosis of granulomatosis with polyangiitis was considered in this patient. Going back to the first case that we actually saw. So this patient presenting where we consider alveolar hemorrhage as one of the possibilities. We considered for alveolar hemorrhage, we typically consider a triad of hemoptysis, drop in hemoglobin, and a new X-ray infiltrate. However, bear in mind that hemoptysis is seen in only 2/3 of patients, and a drop in HP can be difficult to appreciate if the baseline HP is not known. So the diagnosis is usually achieved by BAL, where the BAL returns are increasingly hemorrhagic or persistently hemorrhagic. In case there is often doubt, then one can do cytologies. This is true for chronic alveolar hemorrhage, not acute alveolar hemorrhage, where there can be hemocyte-related macrophages in the cytology. Again, alveolar hemorrhage is seen in a wide variety of conditions. Apart from the ANCA-associated vasculitis, it can be seen in Goodpasture syndrome. It can be seen in immune complex mediated vasculitis, secondary vasculitis, IgA vasculitis, Behçet's, drugs, as well as acute rejection due to post-transplantation. Any diffuse alveolar damage itself can be associated with a certain degree of diffuse alveolar hemorrhage as well. Without capillaritis, one can see alveolar hemorrhage in patients with idiopathic pulmonary hemocentrosis, certain patients on anticoagulation and antiplatelet therapy, and sometimes in mitral stenosis, PCH, and PVOD. So let's go to another example for alveolar hemorrhage to see how often different diagnoses can be picked up. This is a 55-year-old male with a rash over his legs, back, abdominal pain, and hematochezia for the last 15 days. Not an smoker, was a farmer, and all serological markers were negative. CBC did not show eosinophilia, normal creatinine, but urine routine showed RBCs, WBCs, as well as albuminuria. Platelet counts were normal, and CT showed crazy baby. On examination, this was this characteristic punched out kind of ulcer, which raised the possibility of vasculitic syndrome. And X-ray showed on the left low predominant consolidation, aciness, which was consistent with alveolar hemorrhage. So again, the choice of test to prove alveolar hemorrhage was bronchoscopic lavage, which confirmed alveolar hemorrhage in this patient. Simultaneously a skin biopsy was done. The skin biopsy showed that there was evidence of IgA deposition on the skin, and there was evidence of neutrophilic infiltration into the subdermal area. This patient also had significant proteinuria during his course. There was evidence of worsening renal functions. He underwent a biopsy. Biopsy showed expansion of the mesangium, and that is brought out beautifully by the Mason's trichome stain below, and that was positive by IgA. So diagnosis of IgA vasculitis or Henoch-Schönlein purpura in an adult was made. Now this is a fairly rare diagnosis in adults. In its pediatric disease, what is even rarer is alveolar hemorrhage in an adult. So overall, Henoch-Schönlein itself is rare in an adult. So we did a systematic review. At that time, we had found only 36 cases of alveolar hemorrhage with Henoch-Schönlein purpura, and we saw that it was actually quite variable. Alveolar hemorrhage can occur years after the diagnosis of Henoch-Schönlein, and it's probably being not picked up quite early because majority of the patients actually had hemoptysis, drop in hemoglobin in this series of patients, and then a large proportion of patients were ventilated. So consequently, possibly because diagnosis was not being considered early, there was a higher mortality and a larger recurrence with these patients. Therapy was often with cyclosporin and steroid. Going to another patient, this is an 18-year-old male with rash over the legs, back, associated with hemoptysis of 15-day duration. He was a current smoker, smoking 5 to 6 cigarettes per day. There was no evidence of eosinophilia. Creatinine was normal, platelets were normal, urine routine was normal. Now, X-ray showed right low consolidation, so he had been given IV antibiotics, but he had one bout of massive hemoptysis, so she was referred to our hospital. When we saw him, there was evidence of painless, like redness of both eyes, with swelling around multiple venipuncture sites. So when we saw the X-ray, it was pretty globular, so it asked for a contrast CT. Now this contrast CT clearly showed a right low lobe kind of pseudoaneurysm of the right low lobe pulmonary artery, and the lung window showed this beautiful crazy appearing with focal around that particular blood vessel with focal consolidation. So a diagnosis of a pulmonary artery pseudoaneurysm with alveolar hemorrhage was made. So given the recurrent oral ulcers, uveitis, skin manifestation, pathogy, and pulmonary artery pseudoaneurysms, a diagnosis of Behçet's was made. The differential diagnosis of pulmonary artery pseudoaneurysm causing alveolar hemorrhage in this patient would be several infections. Typically, Mucor, especially after COVID, is an important consideration, and we've had several patients with Mucor having pseudoaneurysm. Tricuspid infective endocarditis is something else again, which can cause kind of cavity as well as alveolar hemorrhage. Um, Rarely, lung abscesses, either due to tuberculosis or bacterial, can have Rasmussen's aneurysm and hemorrhage, massive hemoptysis. The other causes are, malignancy or procedural related. Behçet's, of course, completes the list. So this index patient was managed with embolization of the pulmonary artery, and he remains fine on azathioprine and tapering dose of steroids. Finally, to complete the alveolar hemorrhage scenario, I have one last case. This is a 22-year-old patient who had breathlessness for 3 months prior to presentation, was associated with cough but no hemoptysis, and he had no comorbidities. He had intermittent diarrhea since childhood. Examination was unremarkable except like short stature and marked pallor with a systolic murmur in the apex. Hemoglobin was 5, and there was evidence of iron deficiency anemia on the peripheral smear. Bronchoscopic returns were normal, and all the microbiologic evaluation was negative, but the cytology showed alveolar hemocentrum-laden macrophages. We also did a TBB in this patient because the bronchoscopic returns were normal, so had not made a diagnosis of alveolar hemorrhage at that point. So the transbronchial lung biopsy showed kind of a bland alveolar hemorrhage, which I'll be showing you. This is the initial X-ray, and this is the initial CT showing focal kind of spread GGO in the right lower lobe with some central lobular nodules. On the left is the transbronchial lung biopsy, 2 fragments, which you can show. We can clearly see the RBCs in the alveoli, and that is brought out beautifully by the Pearl stain here. And this patient had out of proportion hemoglobin of 5 and short stature, which and intermittent diarrhea, which raised the possibility of celiac at that time in this patient. So we also did an upper GI endoscopy and a D2 biopsy that showed effacement of the villi with extensive intraepithelial lymphocytes. So we gave a challenge of a gluten-free diet, and the diagnosis and anti-endomysial antibodies were requested, and that was strongly positive. So a diagnosis of Lane-Hamilton syndrome, which is nothing but celiac disease with IPH, was made in this patient. The third prototypic syndrome, apart from cavities, alveolar hemorrhage, is a rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis. So we often do not get to see these patients initially. This is often seen by the nephrologist, but you can be called if there are lung findings to put a syndromic diagnosis. So this, for example, was a challenging case. This was a 38-year-old female who was a diabetic for 5 years, had evidence of retinopathy, presented with cough and breathlessness for 2 months, no anorexia or weight loss. There was associated oliguria and edema. There was no particular exposures. Blood pressure was actually on the higher side. Creatinine was 2.4 on admission. There was evidence of RBCs, but no CAS, anemia with normal kidney size. There was normal platelets. ANA, ANCA, anti-GBM, ELISA, C3, C4 were all normal, as were all the viral markers. And INR and APDT was normal. Patient progressively worsened to kind of rapidly progressive renal failure with a creatinine of 7.8 by day 3. ABG showed metabolic acidosis with worsening hypoxemia, so patient was intubated. BAL viral panel was negative. This was prior to COVID, mind you, so just the usual viral panel that was negative. BAL cultures again were sterile, and BAL returns were suggestive of DAH. So a diagnosis of alveolar hemorrhage with a rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis was made. So patient was on the ventilator. We managed to prone the patient and get a kidney biopsy and start the patient like on dialysis prior to the kidney biopsy. Once the diagnosis of alveolar hemorrhage was made, we pulsed the patient with prednisolone and started plasma exchange at that point along with antibiotics. The kidney biopsy showed marked expansion of the mesangium and a lot of inflammation in the tubulointerstitial area. That was positive by PAS and again stained by IgA. So there were few areas of presence which were nicely brought out by these by the stains, special stains, Grocols and others, and this is the IgA staining. So a diagnosis of IgA nephropathy with alveolar hemorrhage was made. Again, this is a rare scenario. There are less than say 30 cases of IgA nephropathy with alveolar hemorrhage reported in the world literature. This patient unfortunately succumbed to her illness, and the postmortem lung biopsy showed areas of extensive bland alveolar hemorrhage with several areas of focal organizing pneumonia in this patient. Again, rapidly progressive nephritis itself can be caused by ANCA-associated vasculitis, anti-GBM disease, SLE, but other causes also come into the mixture, like this patient who had IgA nephropathy. There can be IgA variant of post-infectious glomerulonephritis, MPGN, and to complete the list, allergic interstitial nephritis can also cause a similar kind of a picture. Finally, the prototypic or the polar form of presentation is the pulmonary renal syndrome when you have extensive involvement of both the lung and the kidneys. It's because of capillarities at both of these organs, and this is actually less than 10% of all cases of vasculitis. 80% of these cases are caused by Goodpasture's ANCA-associated vasculitis and SLE, and the remaining 20% due to these rare syndromes like IgA vasculitis, like for example one that I've shown you now. Uncommon causes are in IgA vasculitis, Behçet's, cryoglobulinemia, and drug-induced. In our setting, in the tropics, infections are again a very common differential along with toxins for these patients. So there are a wide variety of differential diagnoses when we consider pulmonary renal syndrome. We need to differentiate them from PRS mimics. When you say mimics, it includes tropical infectious syndromes, infected endocarditis, simple bland pneumonia with renal failure, and other infections. It can include several other conditions like thrombotic microangiopathies, malignancy, drug-induced, etc. So these would be the things. So we looked over a period of 1 year in our ICU. We had about 1,325 admissions. We looked at how common this pulmonary renal syndrome is and how many vasculitic syndromes did we really pick up. Over the course of these, say roughly 10% of these patients actually had renal involvement, which is common in a large medical ICU. So 180 had evidence of pulmonary as well as renal disease. Now, when we excluded patients who had no active sediments, we found 27 patients who had renal, kidney disease, as well as lung disease with active sediments, of which only 13 had pulmonary renal syndrome, which is actually 0.2% of the entire cohort. So the pulmonary renal syndrome mimics were another 6, and of which strep typhus and lepto were the most common. We also had 2 patients with paraquat poisoning, where this ingestion of paraquat was not described initially, at least by the family, and vasculitis was strongly being considered. So how to distinguish pulmonary renal syndrome from pulmonary renal syndrome mimics? In our group cohort, actually, we found that patients with the vasculitis were actually younger. This was primarily because we had more SLE than primary vasculitis in our cohort. We also had a much longer period of symptoms prior to diagnosis in the vasculitic syndrome cohort. We also had patients with not much fever in the vasculitic degree cohort. We also had significantly more hypotension, meaning probably that these patients were recognized a bit later, and mortality, of course, was was more in the vasculitic syndrome as opposed to the infectious disease cohort. So going to the next question, what are the distinguishing clinical features of the individual syndromes? How do I diagnose GPA, MPA, and EGPA? So this is overall a constellation of findings. GPA is a granulomatous disease with vasculitis in the lung and kidney. Nodules and cavitary disease in the lung is the most common presentation. Less than 5 to 15% can have alveolar hemorrhage. Upper airway destructive lesions with saddle nose, ocular orbit involvement is characteristic of GPA and makes the diagnosis of GPA. Kidney disease is seen in 70 to 80% and can develop during therapy. Mononeuritis multiplex is another important feature. Cardiac involvement is rare but can happen. And 80 to 85%, especially if systemic vasculitis, can have ANCA positive, and this is typically PR3 ANCA or C ANCA. When you speak about MPA, upper airway disease is not common and does not occur, definitely is not destructive. Lung disease is less common, but alveolar hemorrhage is of these patients more common. Renal disease is way more common, and focal segmental glomerulonephritis is the most common presentation. Again, neurological manifestations are more common. These patients tend to have kind of more chronicity on initial evaluation. They tend to be evenly split between MPO as well as PR3 ANCA. Now, EGP or Churg Strauss syndrome is an entirely total beast where this is associated with asthma. 80% actually have long-standing asthma, and then it goes on to a hypereosinophilic state and then a vasculitic state where there can have involvement in, say, GIT, nerves, etc., and kidneys. During the hypereosinophilic phase, they can have marked cardiac involvement. So either a vasculitic syndrome or a hypereosinophilic syndrome can be the manifestation of EGPA, again evenly split between MPO and PR3 ANCA. Now the other immune complex associated diseases which should be considered are GPS and Goodpasture syndrome and SLE. Again, these are capillarities associated with both the lung as well as the kidney, and other syndromes are not common. So SLE will be diagnosed based on the standard criteria, also associated with SLE like arthritis, uveitis, etc., where we look at the characteristic syndrome, and GPS is often picked up based on the syndrome as well as the antibody being present. So there is increasing information that between the vascular syndrome, it is more important now to classify patients by the type of ANCA involvement rather than trying to label them as GPA or MPA, because disease specificity or the future course of the disease depends more by the ANCA type of ANCA at presentation. So in Caucasians, PR3 ANCA is way more common than MPO ANCA. They tend to be younger than the MPO ANCA patients, and they tend to have more necrotizing vasculitis and granulomatous inflammation, more acute presentation, and more relapse. For treatment, they tend to have better response to rituximab as opposed to cyclophosphamide. Whereas MPO ANCA tends to occur in older patients. They tend to have no granulomas, no upper airway disease. They have more indolent course, more chronic vasculitic damage, and poorer prognosis overall. And therapy is the same as cyclophosphamide is equal to rituximab, and rarely these can have a ILD with a UIP kind of presentation as well. So how will we establish the diagnosis of pulmonary vasculitis? Now again, this comes when I talked about the nomenclature system, which is the Chapel Hill. There are classification criteria which have been laid down by American College of Rheumatology or the European League Against Vasculitis. So these have classification criteria for individual syndromes. And then there is something called the diagnostic criteria. But these things are present, then you diagnose the disease. So all these three things are totally different. So you should not be using nomenclature or classification criteria to diagnose the disease in an individual patient. For example, when you speak about classification syndrome, this is the ACR criteria 1990 for Goodpasture syndrome. For vaginous granulomatosis. So they say that you have to have 2 out of the 4 to diagnose GPA. Now, bear in mind, this again does not have 100% specificity for the diagnosis of GPA. So, in reality, in real life, all patients need not have fulfilled criteria for classification criteria. These are more for uniform enrollment of patients into clinical trials than actual clinical practice. So, currently, this is a large cohort of 6,000 patients being assembled by the Americans and Europeans to see how to classify patients into the individual vasculitic syndromes of ANCA-associated vasculitis, and they have now come up with a provisional criteria which is being validated in the bigger cohort. So as you can see, there is an outsize weightage for ANCA, which is not there in the earlier classification criteria by ACR. So, and then this seems to be fairly easy to use. We need to see if this is getting validated in as we go along. So to come back to the individual patient, when we diagnosed alveolar hemorrhage based on the alveolar returns, CRP was high, but all cultures were negative. So we next sent an ANCA, and then we got back the ANCA report is strongly positive. Now, how to interpret this ANCA? There are ANCA is nothing but anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibody. There are broadly three types of ANCA. If the ANCA antigen is myeloperoxidase, that is a very negative then it is it is a very positive antigen. It is attracted by the negative charges on the DNA. So it tends to migrate to the perinuclear area, and that is why you get the characteristic P-ANCA pattern. Whereas PR3 being the cytoplasm is more uniformly stained and gives rise to the diffuse cytoplasmic pattern or the C-ANCA pattern, which is more specific for PR3. The perinuclear pattern is actually more less specific, so it can be seen in a wide variety of other enzymes. So it's important to confirm that again, that MPO is the target, because this is the one which is associated with the ANCA-associated vasculitis. Again, certain atypical ANCA patterns are also described due to variety of other antigens. These are more commonly seen in other conditions like ulcerative colitis, etc. So this is about the ANCA antibodies. Bear in mind that not all patients with ANCA-associated vasculitis will have ANCA. So there is an entity called ANCA-negative vasculitis. This is because of the different genetics that these people have, and then the particular antigen is and antibodies are not picked up in the usual assays because of inhibition by ceruloplasmin. So this is about, and then again we're talking about atypical ANCA, which can be false positive in several conditions like infective endocarditis and other conditions, primary biliary cirrhosis and cystic fibrosis, which may be conditions which may be confused sometimes with these patients. We have come a long way when ANCA was first described in 1985 to currently now the draft criteria giving an outsized role for ANCA in the diagnosis of these patients. Initial consensus on use of the ANCA described that you should always test for ANCA using the immunofluorescence. The ideal situation would be test for both using ELISA as well as the immunofluorescence. And they required described a staged approach where if the IF is negative, then one disregards the diagnosis of ANCA-associated vasculitis. If it is positive, it confirms by using the type of particular ELISA. Currently, the recommended approach is a gating strategy where the first test of choice is actually an immunoassay, given that ELISAs have now become very specific and sensitive. So the immunofluorescence requires expertise, and so that is no longer now the preferred strategy. The first is the ELISA, which is now recommended as the diagnosis, provided your lab is good and has a standardized ELISA strategy. So in alveolar hemorrhage syndromes or pulmonary renal syndromes, one looks at the antibodies and can do a renal biopsy. One often does not do a lung biopsy when you think of a primary pulmonary renal syndrome, because often these patients are sick, and the lung biopsy often does not reveal a particular diagnosis, like does not show granulomas. It only shows alveolar hemorrhage at best, which you can pick up by lavage. When you have focal confluent or a rapidly progressive glomerular nephritis, again the approach is the same. Kidney biopsy would be the first option along with the serology. If you have lung nodules with cavitation, again ANCA, and the choice of biopsy will be the ENT biopsy, especially if the ENT system is involved, or otherwise a surgical lung biopsy. If you have upper airway disease alone, surgical biopsy along with ANCA would be the approach of choice. So the index patient, ANCA was strongly positive, 3+, and of C-ANCA pattern, PR3 ANCA was 3+, and ANA was negative, and anti-GBM antibodies were negative, C3, C4 was normal. So diagnosis of ANCA-associated vasculitis, possibly GPA was made, and we then are left with how to manage this patient. So when we manage this patient, we classify this patient as to localized disease, early systemic disease, generalized disease, severe disease, or refractory disease. A localized disease is when it involves only a localized organ system, namely the upper respiratory tree. Early systemic is when there can be constitutional symptoms, but no major organ involvement. If there is evidence of renal involvement along with lung involvement, then it becomes generalized disease. If the renal involvement is severe, or if there is life-threatening alveolar hemorrhage, it becomes severe disease. And refractory disease is some therapy if there is failure to go into remission. The other way to stage ulcerative vasculitis like polyarteritis nodosa and importantly Church syndrome is the 5-factor score, which is associated with mortality in these patients. So age, absence of upper airway involvement, significant GI, kidney and cardiac disease, each being scored with 1 point, is associated with prognosis in EGPA. So when you see about how to manage these patients, there are about these number of like significant trials in the history of ANCA-associated vasculitis. I will mention few of these trials, all of which are seminal trials, and then if you have time, you should go through some of them at least. So broadly speaking, therapy involves 2 phases: induction, maintenance, and there are recently some other interesting other alternative approaches. Induction therapy is to push the patient into remission, and maintenance therapy is to keep the patient into remission. So induction therapy was the initial trial in 1995 by the NIH group. So they studied cyclophosphamide. Fauci's group published on cyclophosphamide for getting patients with ANCA-associated vasculitis into remission, and showed that about 90% of patients can go into remission using oral cyclophosphamide. And this was the seminal trial. This was an open arm, single arm, open label trial. Subsequently, there were the paradigm changed with the Cyclops trial, which showed that use of IV cyclophosphamide was similar in terms of remission induction with as opposed to oral cyclophosphamide at actually half the dose of oral cyclophosphamide, which means lesser toxicity. What it did show on long-term follow-up was that the relapse rate was high, as much as 30% with the IV cyclophosphamide arm. So that is in 2014 to 15, the rituximab came into the picture, and there are 2 large trials: the RAVE trial and the rituximab trial, with a slightly overlapping methodology, which compared rituximab with cyclophosphamide, showing that both were similar for induction. We'll be talking about this briefly. The Ritazaram trial has actually confirmed that in relapsing disease, rituximab is pretty efficacious in pushing patients into remission, and 90% of patients will go into remission using rituximab. In patients who have non-severe disease, mycophenolate is again an alternative to cyclophosphamide and has equivalent efficacy, 87%, to achieve induction. When you speak about remission, relapses are the biggest problems in patients with vaginous granulomatosis. The paradigm changed in 2003 with the publication of the Cyzaram trial, which compared continuation of cyclophosphamide versus azathioprine, showing that azathioprine was quite efficacious and less toxic than cyclophosphamide. Further approaches tried MMF. The improved trial compared MMF versus azathioprine to maintain remissions, but showed that MMF actually had a higher relapse compared to azathioprine. The paradigm changed again in 2014 with the main RITSAN trial, which compared rituximab versus azathioprine for maintenance. Now, this arm had 5% relapse over 16 months in the rituximab arm versus 29% in the azathioprine arm. So, indicating that probably rituximab is way superior to azathioprine to maintain remission in patients with GPA. Subsequent extensions of this trial, the French trial, main RITSAN 2 and main RITSAN 3, have tested various approaches to keep these patients in remission. Main RITSAN 2 used a blind versus a CD19 based approach, found that there was really no big difference. Main RITSAN 3 is ongoing now, studying rituximab maintenance at 2 doses, 0, 14, 6 months, 18 months, and 14 months, which is the best, but this is studying 1 gram. There are also other major trials which have studied plasma exchange as well as oral versus low dose steroids, and other approaches like complement inhibition in patients with GPA. And these are ongoing trials which are studying other approaches like low dose rapid reduction of steroids and ongoing rituximab maintenance, 500 milligrams up to a period of 60 months in patients with GPA. So when you speak about remission induction, this should be related to the intensity of the disease. So you have a patient with only lung-limited disease, it is reasonable to only use cyclophosphamide or only even mycophenolate to induce remission in these patients instead of hitting these patients very hard. If you have also, it's important to differentiate chronicity and drug toxicity when you have a patient with activity, especially somebody who's relapsed. Cyclophosphamide, it's important to hydrate the patients properly, give mesna, dose modify for renal involvement, and to choose pulse over oral form. And this is based on good evidence. Cyclophosphamide is less favored over rituximab when you have a young person who's in the reproductive age or who's concerned about toxicity about cyclophosphamide. Most patients would go into remission over the next 3 to 4 months, and these are all the trials that have considered in the appropriate group. We have briefly talked about RAVE and rituximab, which are complementary trials, again showing that in RAVE trial, these patients who are very severe were excluded, whereas these patients who are very severe were actually included in rituximab trial. This was the rituximab trial was a very small trial. The RAVE was a fairly large trial, about 200 patients. This was an open label trial. This was a placebo controlled trial. In they had fair number of GPA patients and MPA patients. DH was seen in roughly about 28% of patients in the RAVE group, whereas this is not available in the patients with rituximab group. The protocol for rituximab was similar. Cyclophosphamide was not allowed in the RAVE group, whereas all patients had to receive cyclophosphamide in the rituximab trial. So there are significant differences between the RAVE trial and the rituximab trial. What is important is that the primary outcome was non-inferior for both these patients, indicating that rituximab was the same as cyclophosphamide, but for relapsing patients, rituximab was superior to cyclophosphamide in the RAVE trial. So the index case, we induced with pulse methylprednisolone, then rituximab, 1000 milligram over every 2 weeks. This is the RA protocol that is used, that has been kind of borrowed into the vasculitis protocol as well, along with the Septran, calcium, osteoporosis. She went into remission. So that raises the question as how will you follow this patient? The options when these patients are in remission is to give them azathioprine or rituximab. The dosing of rituximab is based on either fixed strategy or by the CD19 indicating B cell depletion. We follow the patients with using the Birmingham vasculitis score and the vasculitis damage index, hoping for a relapse rate of less than 5%. We can expect, for example, on azathioprine at 60 months, if you treat only for 18 months, roughly around 71% of the patients in rituximab arm will be free of relapse, whereas in azathioprine, 1 in 2 only will be free of relapse. So this is the reason why rituximab is increasingly being favored in especially patients who are PR3 ANCA positive. I quickly taper the steroid and keep the steroid by 5 milligram. I do not stop the steroid completely because there is a group of thought which believes that stopping the steroid is associated with higher rates of relapse. It's important to consider vaccination, osteoporosis prophylaxis, Septran, management of comorbidities, sperm and overbanking, especially if cyclophosphamide is being chosen, monitoring IgG levels because hypoglycemia is a problem with rituximab, and doing age-specific cancer screening. I've had patients on rituximab who developed ovarian cancer, another patient who developed lymphoma, so I'm kind of paranoid about this. Especially, you should have a heightened risk of thromboembolism in patients with GPA, and of course, like I've said, we monitor side effects of therapy and damage due to vasculitis per se. So this is due to the vasculitis, whereas this is due to the damage due to vasculitis. So where is therapy in vasculitis going? In pulmonary vasculitis, increasingly we are using rituximab as first line in most patients, especially for PR3 positive disease and relapsing disease. We are using a fixed dose of rituximab for maintenance, 500 milligrams every 6 months till 24 months at least. With patients with some prolongation beyond 24 months in patients who are showing some evidence of persisting lingering disease. Low dose steroid is a quick taper to 5 milligram by 6 months. There is an interest in use of avocapan, which is a steroid sparing agent in GPA, and use of Plex after the Plexivas trial being restricted to only patients with refractory disease and DH patients. One can expect 70% survival by 5 years in patients with GPA with this particular regimen. Most of the deaths are due to infection, with some deaths due to thromboembolic disease and renal failure and drug toxicity. So I think I come to the end of this very, very exhausting, I think, talk, and I'm open to take any questions.
Any questions you can type in the chat box, or you can directly ask also. Then Kishore has a question.
Right.
Hi, sir. Is there any role of follow-up testing of ANCA to know about disease activity?
Generally, no. So the traditional paradigm is that ANCA testing does not have any role in follow-up because the vast majority of patients who have ANCA rise do not relapse on follow-up. So the positive predictive value is quite low. Having said that, the in the Main-Rixan 3 trial, they found that patients who had while on rituximab a higher titer of ANCA, there was a higher predilection towards relapse. So that trial has kind of put the entire question back into the burner. Till that trial, this was kind of a fairly done deal. In fact, the 2017 statement, consensus statement, clearly states that there is no role of ANCA in follow-up testing. But and also the statement, EULAR statement also says that there is no role of ANCA. But the Main-Rixan trial, 3 trial suggested that ANCA titers are predicted. So this is something that one should be following, especially when the Ritazaram trial is published. One will be looking for whether there is any role of ANCA in predicting this.
Thank you, sir.
We have one patient of EGPA, and he responded to rituximab, actually essentially treated by the nephrologist. And after that, he is in a constant remission, but he often comes with the symptoms of asthma exacerbation. And it frankly responds to bronchodilators and sometimes an oral steroids for maybe 3 to 5 days. That too, we may have to use the oral steroids just for 3 days or 5 days in a year once. And otherwise, he's fine. So they can have this different component, these things.
Yeah, so EGPA can be like a very, very vexing disease to treat, like because so there is this hypereosinophilic only variant where they don't have much vasculitis. They have asthma, then they develop eosinophilia. They don't yet go into vasculitis. Some of them don't go at all. Some of them may be going on later on, especially if you taper on off the steroid. Now, so now these patients where you often consider like TPE and other things to begin with, and then you finally diagnose. I've had patients who I consider chronic eosinophilic pneumonia first, and then the PR3 ANCA on screening, just on screening, was like markedly positive. So, so there can be an overlap, well described in literature, between chronic eosinophilic pneumonia and EGPA. And this is just the hypereosinophilic variant. So these patients will tend to be on and off. They'll have a relapse, so they'll have asthma exacerbations. They'll have eosinophilia going up. So you'll maybe a EGPA exacerbations as well. Whereas when you see the vasculitis per se, that is the other variant. They don't have much. Or they may have very little eosinophilia. Eosinophilia is not the marked presentation. Tend to have more kidney manifestations, more cardiac, and less cardiac. More renal, more GI, and more neuropathy. So especially the ones that you get from the neurologist, mononeuritis multiplex, GI disease, and nephrologist, they tend to be the vasculitic variant. Usually in these patients, the vasculitis does not relapse that much.
Okay.
That is like overall what I've seen. What usually relapses will be like their asthma exacerbations, seasonal exacerbations. So.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think Dr. Kiran has a question.
Sir, good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Thank you for that talk, sir. Sir, just one doubt. You had shown in one of your patients that the BAL was clear, but you sent for hemocyanin-laden alveolar macrophages. So when you get a sequential lavage which is not showing that deepening color, should we still keep the cytology report for Perline staining?
Yeah, so that is only if there is indolent alveolar hemorrhage, like in patients with idiopathic pulmonary hemosiderosis. Now, that was a consideration in that patient when he had such severe anemia, actually. So
Okay.
we had anemia and we had like consolidation. So we had thought of alveolar hemorrhage, and I was very surprised when the BAL returns were not hemorrhagic. So we had collected the BAL and sent it for cytology, and then done a transbronchial lung biopsy, thinking it's something else. Now the transbronchial lung biopsy was reported first, saying that this is showing extensive alveolar hemorrhage, but it's bland. Then I went to the cytology people and asked them to stain using Pearl stains, and they saw extensive alveolar HLMs actually. Now the problem with HLM is the cutoff is not very clearly described in literature. So like they say, if you see 25 to 50 per high far field, like that, some literature is described. but it's not very clear what is the exact number of cells that you need to see to really diagnose. So what is really diagnostic is persistent or increasing alveolar hemorrhage returns on BAL, that is diagnostic. But if you have chronic indolent, then you can look at HLMs as a to support your finding.
Okay. And sir, one doubt. You said EGPA, usually the ANCA is usually negative. So do you do the T-ANCA in EGPA?
So EGPA ANCA is not usually negative. It will be positive in 60 to 70% of the time. So the diagnosis of EGPA is of course not based on the ANCA alone. It is based on the constellation of symptoms. So you will have asthma, you will have the other vasculitis. If the presentation is vasculitis, EGPA vasculitis, then you have the mononeuritis multiplex. You have IgE more than 1000. You have eosinophils more than elevated, and all of these are part of the diagnostic criteria. Now there is I already presented a draft criteria going around that includes EGPA also. So I think in the coming year this will get validated. It involves a very large cohort of EGPA patients, because EGPA is as such a very rare disease. The largest published cohort I am aware of is like 138 patients or something like that. So
Okay.
so you should I probably have seen about 10 patients till date. So that is so it's not a very common disease, I would say. So
do they have dominant gut manifestations? Gut
they can have. I must say that only one of my 10 patients have actually had dominant gut manifestation.
Right.
But it's described in literature that gut manifestations can be prominent, and cardiac manifestations is usually the thing that kills these patients.
Okay, sir. Sir, one more last doubt. Have you diagnosed unilateral consolidations later turning out as alveolar hemorrhages?
Alveolar hemorrhage, no, but unilateral consolidation, which actually subsequently cavitated and then diagnosed vaginous in that patient. And another patient where actually had a unilateral consolidation, biopsy showed organizing pneumonia. And that patient had fever. We gave antibiotics thinking it's post-viral pneumonia or a post-viral organizing pneumonia. Patients and fever did not get better with antibiotics. Then we gave steroid, got markedly better, went home and came back with a huge alveolar hemorrhage.
Okay.
And then diagnosed vaginous granulomatosis in that patient. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Giridhar, I'm not able to hear you.
We also have observed this north and south divide, what we have mentioned, because the primary vasculitis were very common in Lucknow.
Yeah.
Here it is not at all. Means many times we very eagerly evaluated and found out to be something else.
Quite. Even in JIPMER, I did not find that much. I thought it was a referral institute. We should have a lot of patients, but that paper was from JIPMER actually, so we didn't really have that many primary vasculitic syndrome.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, sir. It was very extremely elaborative and in-depth analysis and explanation of the vasculitis and pulmonary renal syndromes. And thank you again for your time and sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you again. Hope to see you more often on this platform. Maybe next time would be lung transplantation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye, sir.
Stay in touch. Bye.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.